Right, so news has dropped yesterday of PFL and Bellator putting together one of those famous versus cards that we've seen in the past. Bellator's done it with Ryzen or Risen, however you pronounce it. I thought it was Ryzen. But now that PFL has actually bought Bellator, we are starting off 2024 and they are putting together this Ultimate Champions versus Champions card. And that is what we are going to be talking about in today's video. Now, firstly, I just want to apologize to you guys because I had a super busy day yesterday. And what I usually do with my videos, a little behind the curtain here, is I will think about what I'm going to say pretty much all day. And if I have time, I'll even jot it down and write a light script. But yesterday I was so flat out, I didn't have time to even think about MMA at all, which sucks because there was a bunch of good news. But this morning I caught up on everything. So I'm just going to give you my general sort of freestyle thoughts on this. And I just want to start right away at the top. I need to be very honest with you all from the onset, right? When I watch MMA, I am constantly watching UFC MMA content. But when I do feel like something different and I want to play around in different organizations, I will very often go to ONE because I find their fights to be the most exciting next to MMA. In fact, I even did a video that shows ONE has way more finishes than the UFC. UFC, I think, is ranked like the second lowest finish rate out of most of the major MMA organizations. So, and ONE is ranked super high. I think from memory, it was like second or third. So I find ONE to be a far more interesting organization to watch. Plus, they have quite a lot of Australian talent because of where ONE is based down in the southeast region. So I'm either watching UFC or I'm watching ONE. And then if I'm not watching UFC or ONE, then I'll be watching Australian MMA on Fight Pass, which is Eternal. And then if I'm not watching Eternal, I'll probably jump on and start watching Cage Warriors. All of that to say, I tried to give Bellator a chance, right? Like around, what was it? Probably 2017, 2018. I was like, look, let me give Bellator a chance. And I started looking to the east for some links. And every time I watched Bellator, it was just boring, man. It was just low production. The fights were they should be, they weren't good enough to be like MMA, UFC fights. They were professional fighters. They're great fighters, but the fights just weren't that exciting. And what is so great about not amateur organizations, but feeder organizations like Cage Warriors or like Eternal or like LFA is that you've got these young, hungry, up-and-coming kids that want to get a Bellator contract or want to get a UFC contract, and their skills aren't quite there, and it just makes for far more dangerous fights. Wherever at Bellator, it was like, these guys are professionals, they're great athletes, but they've got their contracts, they're in Bellator, and it all just seems a bit missing that, whatever that is. Bellator just missed that, and it really dropped me as a fan, and I very rarely ever clicked on it unless it was like a big beta card. I really enjoyed watching beta anytime the Pitbulls were on there. I loved watching them. When Yoel Romero first went over there, I watched that entire card, and that was just a letdown again. Yoel Romero is just the constant letdown artist ever since, for years now. It's just so disappointing. So Bellator really dropped me as a fan. And with PFL, I would give PFL a chance. I'd click on some PFL fights. I'd watch PFL, but again, without the elbows and just the way that they set up their entire system, where early in the year, fighters are thinking about points and longevity, which means early in the year when you're like, right, it's a fresh year, this is a fresh season, let's get into this. Their fights are lackluster and underwhelming to watch, which sort of sucks because then as the year goes on, and the UFC ramps up and all the other organizations ramp up, you're looking at PFL and you just have this sour taste in your mouth of what happened last time. So to say all of that, I'm not the biggest PFL fan and I'm not the biggest Bellator fan. So I'm not going to try and break down this card to be like, I'm some MMA bloody expert, mate. I know exactly what's going on here. I don't. But this does intrigue me. This does intrigue me massively because I think this is the exact move that the new PFL Bellator organization needed to make. I made a video a couple of weeks ago now talking about how the UFC is becoming more and more WWE-esque, right? And what I meant by that is that we're getting fights. Colby Leon is a perfect example of that. And To go on with that, I use John Jones versus Stipe as another example, and even Chito Vera versus Sean O'Malley as another example. These are all fights that are being put up there because it's being so heavily WWE-atized over at the UFC. And if the PFL have this merit-based system, that you can go back and watch the whole video to like explain my breakdown of that. But PFL are going to have a lot more eyes on them this year because of the Francis Ngannou situation, because of the Jake Paul situation, because of buying Bellator. They're going to have a lot more eyes on them. And if they can create some noise and create some action with their merit-based system up against the WWE style system of the UFC, then they might start to drag more eyes over towards the PFL. And this card, to start off the year with lining up a bunch of Bellator champions and then lining up a bunch of PFL champions and be like, here we are, this is it, we're starting fresh from now, is a great way to start that year off, because straight away you're bringing eyes over to the new PFL. And if they can carry that momentum over into their next pay-per-view, like if they now, when this card airs, they need to announce the Jake Paul fight. They need to, because they're never going to have more eyes on them than they are with this fight. Or they need to announce Francis's fight. I know that Francis is lined up to fight Anthony Joshua, but they cannot have this pay-per-view going and then announce a Kayla Harris fight. They need way more star power than that. Because if you notice what the UFC does, the UFC will promotion build their next card during the pay-per-view of the previous card. Like when we're sitting down to watch 297 this weekend, right before the main event and co-main event, there is going to be a massive hype up ad for UFC 298. And there are also going to be full card announcements for the next 2 or 3 months. UFC are in the business of, when your eyes are on the sport, watching the fight, telling you why your eyes should be on the sport next week. And this is the biggest chance that PFL and Bellator have, not PFL and Bellator, this is the biggest chance that PFL have to do that, to keep people watching for the next thing. Now, the one big thing that is coming across from this card being released is that a lot of the star power here is on Bellator's side. So I'm very interested to see how they're going to start transitioning that star power over into PFL. I know that they're going to keep the Bellator name going for a little bit, and I would purely assume that is just until the TV contracts wrap up, and then Bellator will be completely folded into the PFL. So this is a great way to see, like, if a PFL champion wins a Bellator, like what is this title going to be called? Is this going to be called a PFL title? Is this going to be called a Bellator title? And how is that going to roll through going into their merit-based season for next year? I don't know. That's something that we're going to have to find out together. Another thing that sprung to mind on this is that the PFL are finally starting to see that we need elbows in the PFL, and knees to a grounded opponent as well. But they are bringing in elbows for this card, which is awesome. And I think they need to carry that across to their entire season. Their entire season is ruined by this takedown, ground and pound, wet blanketing, because you can't throw elbows. Their striking is less interesting because you can't throw elbows, step in elbows. So if they have elbows on this card, they need to bring that in forward going on to their next few cards. What fights are we even excited to see on this card? For me, the Ryan Bader fight it's a bit interesting because you have to ask, how is he going to go against Francis Ngannou? And this is a great way to just see him tested once again. Like, Bader's a great fighter. So to get more information on him and keep watching, I love watching that. I mean, Johnny Eblin, great, good names there. Pitbull, always great. But again, these are names that are being brought over from the Bellator side. Like on the PFL side on the card, you've got Thiago Santos, which is like, it's Thiago versus Yoel Romero. That fight is going to suck. To me, the biggest names that I see coming out of this is Magomedov and Clay Collard. They're the two biggest names that I see coming out of this from the PFL side. So all this goes to show is that the PFL did a great job in absorbing Bellator, because they are absorbing some names that have a lot of history behind them. And the PFL just seems to lack its own depth, its own history. I know it was the World Fighting Championships in the past, but there's just none of those names there where you go, oh yeah, like I want to watch that one again. The last thing that I wanted to touch on is this is sort of just exposing the gap between the PFL and the UFC, right? This news dropped yesterday, and this truly is a super card for the PFL. And when I wake up in the morning and I chuck on my headphones and start heading off to the gym, I will chuck on MMA On Point, MMA Junkie, Full Mount MMA, like all the news sources to catch up on what's been happening in the world of MMA since I've been asleep. And none of them mentioned the PFL card that got released. If you go on Twitter, it is all just the talk about UFC 300. And I understand that, you know, it's Thursday in Australia, is it? Yes, it's Thursday in Australia. We're getting into the weekend. It's the UFC's media cycle today for UFC 297. We are in the peak of UFC media machine being churned out, and it is just steamrolling the PFL. And this is the huge uphill battle that the PFL has to face, because even when they release their best card that they have ever put out, like this is the PFL trying to be like, we are here, we are starting off the year with a bang. They put out the best thing that they can put out. UFC 297 is a dud pay-per-view. It is such a flat pay-per-view, and it's meant to be. How many fighters want to spend their entire Christmas and New Year's in a fight camp, getting ready to diet down, stay on weight? January is always a lackluster card for the UFC. So you've got the UFC putting out one of their weakest cards for the year. UFC 297 is going to be one of the weakest cards for the year. And it's steamrolling the best that the PFL can do on social media. And I know the MMA purists won't care about that. The MMA purists are just going to be happy that they get to see this from the PFL. But the PFL is bleeding money. If it wasn't for the Saudis like propping it up, it would not exist. And if we want these competitions, if we want there to be competition in the world of MMA where other companies can exist, then people need to be interested in it. Like, it needs to have people watching it. And the PFL right now doesn't have that. Nobody cares that this got released. Nobody cares. And maybe this is just because we're in the news cycle. We're in the cycle of there is about to be there's about to be a UFC pay-per-view on in a couple of days. And if we can move past that and see as this starts to get noise and starts to get traction, as February starts to build, maybe PFL have a chance. But it's all eyes on the PFL for this one moment, and they need to capitalize on it. Because if it starts off just being another like sleeper card, if it's boring, it's going to hurt them, because people are not going to pay. People aren't even going to waste their time to be bothered to sit down and stream it illegally. Like, you're asking people to give up a couple of hours to sit down and watch these cards, and if it's boring, they just never want to go back, let alone pay God knows how much they're going to charge for it. I mean, honestly, I believe that it should be free. I believe that it should be free, because this is the time to get as many eyes as possible on the PFL. And if you're asking people to put out $80 for this, $50 for this, when it's so easy to just go and find a link, it's incredibly easy. I don't know. I mean, you want to maximize the audience reach right now, but they're just my 2 cents on the PFL versus Bellator supercard that's been put on. I am still going to watch it. I'm excited to see it. Every single year, I'm hoping that the PFL gives us a good year, because more MMA is great. I'd love to watch more MMA. That's wonderful. So I hope that this goes down well for them. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm excited for it. I think it's a great move for the PFL. If you enjoyed this video, let me know it down there in the comments. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you're still here at this stage of the video, it means so much to small creators like myself. And of course, I'll see you all in the next one.